I never thought a letter could ruin a life, but the one taped to my gate that morning nearly did. It wasn't a notice from the city, or a warning about safety. It was from the HOA, and it declared that my land, my sanctuary, was in violation of community standards. They said, my small farm, the place I had poured every ounce of sweat and hope into, had to be cleared within 30 days. Cleared like it was trash. At first, I laughed. I thought it had to be a mistake. But the laughter died the moment I saw the signatures at the bottom. Names I knew. Neighbors I'd waved to for years. People who had once shared my harvests. Who'd smiled at my fence, now signing off on tearing it all down. I remember walking through the rows of my crops that evening, the air heavy and still, wondering how something so harmless could provoke so much hate. They said it was about appearances, but I could feel it was about control, about power. The threat started small: fines, letters, unannounced inspections. Then the whispers began, the looks, the way conversations stopped when I stepped outside. And deep down, I realized this wasn't about my farm anymore. It was about making an example out of me. But if they thought I would roll over and let them destroy what I built, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Because I had something they didn't, a reason to fight. Would you let them take everything from you? Or would you fight back? For years, life in that quiet little neighborhood felt almost perfect. The kind of place where mornings began with the sound of sprinklers and evenings ended with porch lights glowing softly through the trees. My home sat at the very edge of the development, where the manicured lawns met open fields, and beyond them, my small stretch of land, my farm. It wasn't much, just a few acres, a couple of goats, some chickens, and rows of vegetables that I tended myself. It was peaceful, grounded, and honest work. I had bought the property long before the HOA was even established, back when the community was smaller, friendlier, and people minded their own business. I liked it that way. I never cared much for the meetings, the committees, or the constant talk about preserving property values. My world was simpler: wake up, feed the animals, tend the crops, and breathe air that still smelled of earth and rain. Most of my neighbors seemed fine with it. Kids would come by to see the animals, and I'd often leave baskets of fresh produce at a few doorsteps. It made me feel connected, part of something decent. But things started changing when new people moved in, young professionals with perfect lawns, identical fences, and opinions about everything. They called it progress. But to me, it felt like control. The HOA grew stronger, louder, more involved in things that never used to matter. They started sending out new regulations, long lists about what colors homes could be painted, how short the grass should stay, even how many flower pots could be placed by the front door. Most folks just sighed and went along with it. But I noticed the looks some of them gave my farm, how their eyes lingered on the old barn, the dirt road leading up to it, the chickens wandering too close to the fence line. The comments started casually at first. It's not exactly the neighborhood aesthetic, someone said at a block party. Another time a man in a golf shirt laughed and said, my place looked like something out of a different decade. I brushed it off, not realizing those little remarks were the first cracks in what was about to become a landslide. I began to see fewer smiles when I drove through the gates. Some of the same people who used to wave started avoiding eye contact. Rumors spread quietly about smell, noise, property values dropping. But I ignored it. After all, I wasn't hurting anyone. My property was clean, the animals well kept, and I paid my dues on time. Still, something in the air felt different, a kind of tension you couldn't quite name. One morning, I noticed a small sign posted near the community mailbox: HOA meeting. Discussion on property compliance. The word compliance stuck with me. I remember standing there, coffee in hand, staring at that sign while a breeze rattled the papers pinned beside it. My name wasn't on it, but somehow I knew. I knew the storm was moving closer, and I was right in its path. Over the next few weeks, letters began appearing in mailboxes, outlining new enhancement plans and community standards. It all sounded harmless enough until I realized what it meant for me. Buried in the fine print were rules about non-conforming land use and unapproved agricultural structures. My farm, my animals, my livelihood, it all fit neatly into their definition of a violation. And just like that, something that had once been a quiet, peaceful home was being painted as a problem. It's strange how fast a place can turn on you. One day, you're a neighbor. The next, you're the exception. The one who doesn't fit the picture they're trying to frame. I didn't know it then, but the fight for my land, my freedom, and my dignity was just beginning. I thought the first letter had been a mistake. Then came the second. Then the third, each one thicker than the last, printed on glossy paper with that same smug header, Community Compliance Enforcement. The words alone made my stomach tighten. The first fine was small, only a warning about unapproved agricultural use. The second added a demand for immediate corrective action. By the third, they were threatening legal measures. It didn't feel real at first. How could a group of neighbors, people who waved to me at the mailbox, who once bought eggs from me, suddenly decide I was a nuisance? I called the HOA office to reason with them, but reason wasn't something they understood. Each reply came back colder, more procedural, as if I were nothing more than a line item in their system. They said my property disrupted the visual cohesion of the community. That phrase stuck in my mind, echoing with every visit from another clipboard-carrying inspector. They came at dawn, at dusk, snapping photos of the barn, the coops, the fence. Once, I caught one leaning over my gate, measuring the distance from the road to the feed shed. I asked him what he was doing, and he only said, "Verifying." That word cut deep, verifying, as if my life required validation from them. It started to feel like surveillance, like my every move was being watched and logged. The fines increased quickly: $200, then $500, then $1,000 each. One stamped with due dates and threats of lien placement. I wasn't some millionaire with a legal team. I was one person trying to live quietly, but they didn't care about that. They wanted obedience. And I was their example. The mail became a weapon. Every envelope carried a new rule, a new threat, a new demand. Remove unauthorized fencing. Eliminate livestock. Restore natural landscaping. My farm wasn't just land. It was years of work, late nights, scraped hands, and borrowed tools. They wanted it erased because it didn't fit their perfect picture of suburban uniformity. The turning point came one afternoon when I found an orange notice stapled to my front gate. Final warning. Demolition order pending. My heart sank as I read the date circled at the bottom, less than 30 days away. They were serious. I felt panic clawing at my chest, the kind that makes you forget how to breathe. That night, I walked the perimeter of my property, flashlight beam trembling as it brushed across the barn's old wood, the animal pens, the crops swaying gently in the wind. Every inch of it told a story of struggle, of resilience, of belonging. I couldn't let them take it. But how do you fight something built to crush you quietly? I tried reaching out to neighbors, but most avoided me. A few mumbled sympathy, then quickly changed the subject. Others, the ones who joined the HOA board, looked through me like I was already gone. It was isolation disguised as order, and it worked. The more they targeted me, the quieter everyone else became. Fear spreads fast when power is watching. One morning, I woke to find one of my fences cut. The animals were still there, but footprints in the dirt told me someone had been inside. No one admitted to it, of course. The HOA called it a possible vandalism incident, unrelated to association matters. But I knew. I could feel it, the invisible pressure tightening around me, a message left in silence. That's when I started keeping records. Photos, letters, timestamps. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one they couldn't erase. But even as I began collecting proof, I realized something darker. This wasn't just about rules or appearances. It was about control. About a few people deciding who belonged and who didn't. And they'd already decided I was the one who didn't. Still, there's something dangerous about pushing a person who's already lost everything once. I wasn't about to lose again. Not to them. Not to anyone. I started waking up before sunrise. Not out of habit, but out of fear of what I might find next. The silence of the early morning no longer felt peaceful. It felt like anticipation, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Every creak, every sound outside made me wonder if another notice was being taped to my door, another photo taken for their growing file against me. I learned to check the mailbox like a soldier checking for mines, slow, careful, expecting damage. Some days there'd be nothing, and I'd almost allow myself to hope it was over. But hope is a fragile thing in the face of bureaucracy. One morning, a thick envelope arrived, heavier than the rest. Inside was a formal demand letter threatening legal action and outlining continued non-compliance with community ordinances. They attached photos of my goats, my crops, even my tool shed, marked with red arrows as if they were criminal evidence. The letter concluded coldly, "Failure to comply will result in the initiation of property seizure proceedings." I remember standing in my kitchen, that paper trembling in my hands, feeling both fury and disbelief. I wasn't breaking laws. I wasn't hurting anyone. My land had existed before their bylaws did, yet now it was being condemned by them. I called a lawyer, hoping for sense, but he sighed and said the words I feared most: "They can outlast you." That phrase echoed for days. It was the kind of fight that wasn't about truth or fairness, it was about endurance, about who could keep standing when the other ran out of breath. And they had deep pockets, endless patience, and an army of signatures to hide behind. I had one thing they didn't: purpose. But purpose doesn't pay legal fees. I began selling what I could: tolls, spare lumber, anything to stay afloat, while I filed appeals and wrote letters. Every day felt like a test of will. The HOA board continued to escalate. They sent inspectors twice a week, circling like vultures, waiting for weakness. I saw one taking pictures of my compost pile once, pretending to check his phone when I looked up. Another day, a letter arrived fining me for improper visual maintenance of livestock housing. I didn't even know what that meant. They made up new phrases just to find new ways to punish me. Still, I refused to back down. I patched the barn roof myself. I cleaned, I fixed, I improved. Every task became an act of defiance. I wanted them to see that I wasn't going anywhere. But the more I resisted, the more ruthless they became. They began targeting the small things: accusations of excessive noise, complaints about smells, allegations that my animals posed potential health risks. I started to wonder if they were coordinating, if there was a meeting where my name was spoken like a curse. I pictured them sitting around a long table, sipping coffee, congratulating each other on preserving community standards while tearing apart someone's life. The absurdity of it burned, but underneath the anger was something sharper: a growing fear that maybe they could win. The harassment reached a new level when I received a certified letter notifying me of a mandatory board review hearing. It was an ambush, dressed up in formal language. I spent nights preparing my evidence: photos of my clean property, vet records proving my animals were healthy, invoices showing everything was properly maintained. But deep down, I knew logic meant nothing to people who'd already decided to crush me. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn door, and I couldn't shake the image of everything I'd built being stripped away. At dawn, I walked through the farm one last time, committing every sight and sound to memory: the bleating goats, the soft rustle of crops, the smell of soil after rain. It felt like saying goodbye, though I refused to admit it out loud. When the day came, I arrived at the HOA office, a small building that reeked of artificial order: fresh paint, clean carpets, everything sterile and cold. The board members were already seated, 5 of them, each with the same tight expression that said, "This was already decided." They spoke in turns, their words clinical and rehearsed, citing regulations I'd never seen, bylaws I'd never agreed to. They treated me not as a person, but as a problem to be erased. I tried to explain, calmly, that my land had always been like this, that the farm predated the HOA, that I'd done nothing wrong, but they barely listened. One of them kept scribbling notes, another nodded without making eye contact, and when they were done, the chairperson simply said, "We'll notify you of our decision by mail." It was over before it began. I left the building feeling hollow, as though the walls themselves had consumed my words. When I stepped outside, I caught sight of a few familiar faces in the parking lot: neighbors, standing by their cars, watching. Some looked away when I met their eyes, others didn't. One smiled faintly, not with kindness, but with satisfaction. That night, I sat on the porch staring at the horizon, knowing the letter was already written somewhere, waiting to seal my fate. But something inside me shifted. I was done reacting. If they wanted to fight, I'd stop defending and start exposing. They'd pushed me far enough. It was time to push back. I started turning their tactics into evidence. But evidence alone felt fragile against an institution built to ignore inconvenient facts. I taped every letter to a board, labeled each photo with dates, and played back the timeline in my head until the pattern was undeniable. Escalation, then punishment, then silence from the rest of the neighborhood. I began knocking on doors, not to plead or beg, but to ask simple questions. Did they receive the same letters? Did they notice the inspectors? Had anyone else had fences measured? Most answers were evasive. Eyes dropping, doors closing. A few offered sympathetic murmurs and excuses about being too busy. And one older woman shook her head, like she remembered better days, and said nothing more. The isolation widened like a cracked pavement beneath my feet. Social media became a battlefield. Someone started a private group for the neighborhood, ostensibly to share updates and safety tips, but it quickly filled with posts praising the HOA's work and sly photos of my untrimmed hedges. Comments spun narratives I hadn't seen coming. Property values, safety, neighbors' peace. The slivers of truth were woven into a tapestry that made me the villain. And people began to believe the woven story rather than the actual facts. I tried calling meetings, attempting to bring my documentation to light. But the HOA required pre-registration and documentation of concern before allowing anyone to speak. It was protocol dressed as fairness, a machine that digested grievances and spat out delays. Frustration hardened into a resolve so sharp I could feel it in my jaw. I started recording every encounter, meetings, inspections, even casual exchanges at the mailbox. The recordings revealed a choreography of avoidance. Inspectors asking leading questions. Board members citing obscure bylaws, neighbors glancing away. I hired a local journalist after scraping together money from small sales and favors. At first, she hesitated. These stories usually fall flat, unless there's a clear legal violation, she said. I showed her the files, the demolition notice, the inflated fines, the photo logs. She listened, eyes narrowing, and agreed to look into it. The next morning her email arrived with a single line. There's something off here. The journalist's interest felt like a small torch in a dark hallway, but torches attract attention. Within days, the HOA's demeanor shifted, smiles became sharper, their communications more aggressive. They posted notices about community safety at the gates, and hired an outside compliance firm to conduct an emergency review. The firm arrived with clipboards and cameras, their presence designed to intimidate and to create official-looking reports that could be used later. One evening, as I checked the perimeter, I found fresh tracks by the livestock pen tire, marks too deliberate to be random. Someone had driven close enough to scare the animals. And someone else had left a note tucked into the fence slats. A typed paragraph warning that continued non-conformance would lead to further action. Whoever left it had taken the time to look me in the eyes without saying a word. Fear blurred with anger, until I could no longer tell which dominated. I began documenting every unexpected visitor, every inspection, every note. The stack of evidence grew into a makeshift book of grievance. I presented it to the journalist, who published a measured piece that questioned the HOA's motives and highlighted the heavy-handed fines. The article splashed across local feeds, and for a moment, relief washed through me like rain. But the reprieve was short. The HOA responded with a statement accusing me of fabricating complaints and violating neighborhood decorum. They produced before photos of my property from years prior and suggested I had worsened conditions, images that conveniently omitted the repairs and improvements I'd funded myself. The board filed a countersuit, claiming nuisance and asserting the right to enforce aesthetic conformity. Lawsuits cost money and time, and the board's legal counsel moved with calculated speed. I watched as my inbox filled with formal notices, hearings, and deposit requests. Once again, the process felt designed to wear a person down. I rallied Ali's Nabas, who had privately voiced concerns, the journalist who dug deeper, and an old family friend who had seen the property when it was first purchased. Each ally offered a different kind of help: legal referrals, moral support, tips on public records. We dug into the HOA's formation documents and discovered a clause buried in the charter that granted the board extraordinary latitude over non-conforming uses, language vague enough to be weaponized. The discovery felt like both vindication and a new threat. If the clause existed, it could be used against me in court. The weeks that followed blurred into a cycle of filings, appeals, countersuits, and surprise notices. The community meetings grew colder, with board members increasingly confident in their hold. I received an anonymous voicemail one night, a distorted voice warning me that continuing to stir trouble would have consequences. It was a line I had heard before in subtler forms: a look at the mailbox, a car idling too long outside the gate, a stranger asking too many questions. The harassment had crept from official channels into personal intimidation. One morning I discovered that my produce stand where I'd leave boxes of tomatoes for neighbors had been appended. Fruit lay bruised in the grass. A quiet act of vandalism meant to humiliate. The journalist called it psychological warfare, and the word fit in a way nothing else had. I felt exposed, as if the privacy of my small life had been violated by a group determined to demonstrate control. The mounting stress took a toll. Long nights, frayed nerves, and a constant underlying hum of anxiety that never left. Yet under that stress grew a steady current of determination. I refused to be made a cautionary tale. I began organizing a public forum, inviting residents to a neutral venue, and sending formal notices to the HOA demanding transparency. The board responded with a terse email insisting the matter be handled internally. But the journalists had prepared a follow-up, and a small crowd began to assemble the night of the forum. Families curious, a few homeowners ambivalent, a lawyer or two. As people arrived, cameras and phones out, I felt the fragile shape of momentum forming. The board sent a representative who arrived with a stack of pre-printed statements and an air of condescension. He answered questions with rehearsed calm until a man in the back asked why the board had increased inspection frequency and fines specifically for my property. The room grew quiet, and for the first time in months, I saw doubt flicker across a few faces. The representative's composure slipped for a heartbeat, revealing the human behind the suit, and in that moment something shifted. But the shift was brief. As the evening wound down, an unmarked envelope appeared on my car windshield. Inside was a single photograph of my family taken from a distance accompanied by a warning, "Last chance." The arrival of the photo turned the room's energy into something colder, more dangerous. I realized then that the fight had moved beyond bylaws and fines. It had become personal, and the line between legal action and intimidation had been erased. How far would they go to make me disappear from the picture they were painting? The photo haunted me. I placed it face down on my desk, but even through the paper, I could feel the weight of the message behind it. The idea that someone had followed me long enough to capture that shot, that they knew my routines, my family, my schedule turned every quiet sound outside into suspicion. I checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times before sleeping. The once familiar hum of the night now carried a pulse of unease, yet fear and anger share the same root. And over time fear hardened into something sharper. I decided to trace the source of the harassment. I requested access to HOA security logs and inspection reports through the local records office, citing my ongoing case. The board stalled, claiming the documents were confidential. But persistence is a kind of pressure most bureaucracies aren't built to withstand. When the papers finally arrived, heavily redacted, they revealed a pattern: frequent visits by the same board member, a man named Miller, each visit coinciding with the issuance of new fines. Cross-referencing timestamps with my own security footage confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't inspecting, he was searching. One clip showed him leaning against the fence, pointing at the ground as if marking something. Another showed his car idling just beyond my property line late at night. I sent the footage to the journalist, who immediately recognized the implications. "They're trying to manufacture violations," she said, her voice taut with disbelief. The story began taking shape: a tale of power, control, and obsession. The journalist's second article went live within days, and this time, it didn't just question the HOA, it exposed names, actions, and patterns of harassment. The response was explosive. Local news outlets picked it up, social media amplified it, and suddenly, what had been a quiet community dispute became a public controversy. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact now pretended neutrality, afraid of being seen on either side. The HOA held an emergency meeting, declaring the article defamatory and announcing a special assessment to fund their legal defense. It was absurd using residents' own money to protect themselves from accountability, but absurdity had long been their weapon. Still, something shifted in the atmosphere. Anonymous letters of support began arriving at my door. A retired couple from 2 streets over thanked me for standing up to them. Another note, unsigned, simply read, "Keep going, they've done this before." Each message added a thread to a growing web of resistance. People were waking up, realizing the HOA's control wasn't just about lawns and fences, it was about power sustained through silence. The board retaliated by weaponizing procedure. They announced a community compliance audit, an innocuous term that in reality meant months of invasive inspections and data collection. They wanted to bury me in paperwork, to drown my will in a sea of signatures and deadlines. But I adapted. I learned their language, the bureaucratic phrasing, the hollow politeness, the precise way to phrase a counter notice, so it had to be logged. Every letter I sent became a record they couldn't erase. The journalist's third piece hit even harder. It detailed financial inconsistencies, expenses approved without disclosure, contracts awarded to companies linked to board members. The public reaction grew angrier, louder, harder to ignore. Residents demanded transparency. Some called for resignations. The board responded with calm statements, but cracks were forming in their composure. Miller, the man from the footage, resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons. The HOA tried to present it as routine, but everyone could feel the tension. Yet victory remained distant. Days later, I came home to find the barn door forced open, the goats scattered, feed overturned. The sheriff's report labeled it as possible vandalism, but I could see the pattern: punishment disguised as coincidence. Each attack was designed to exhaust me, to make resistance seem pointless. But it had the opposite effect. I began networking with homeowners' rights groups, discovering that my story wasn't unique. Across the state, others had faced similar battles: unfair fines, retaliation, and intimidation. I realized my fight had become symbolic, a rallying point. I contacted local media, recorded statements, and shared my evidence publicly. The narrative shifted. The more they tried to silence me, the louder the story grew. The HOA's next move was subtle but devastating. They froze my account access, claiming I was delinquent on dues due to disputed fines. Without access, I couldn't pay utilities that ran through the association, leaving parts of my property effectively isolated. I appealed, citing procedural violations, and when that failed, I filed a counterclaim alleging targeted harassment. Court dates were set. The hearings were slow, the process designed to wear me thin. But every motion they filed added to the record. Every attempt to silence me became part of the case against them. The journalist's latest report featured that photographed one left on my car, blurring my family's faces but making clear the intimidation. The article's headline, "Cut Deep: When Power Turns Personal, the HOA That Went Too Far." The exposure ignited something. Larger media outlets picked up the story, and for the first time, state regulators began looking into the association's practices. The HOA issued a statement dismissing the reports as media sensationalism, but the pressure was building. Anonymous sources began leaking internal emails, discussions about containment strategy, references to problematic members, and even instructions to limit access to meeting minutes. The truth was unraveling, thread by thread. Still, retaliation continued. One night I found a dead animal left near my fence, a crude message pretending to be coincidence. Another time, a fake notice appeared online claiming my property had been condemned. Each act blurred the line between pettiness and cruelty. Yet, amid the chaos, something remarkable began happening. Unity neighbors who had stayed quiet began voicing support. A petition circulated calling for a vote to dissolve the current board. It gathered hundreds of signatures in days. The power balance was shifting, and the HOA knew it. They launched a desperate smear campaign, accusing me of defamation and inciting unrest. But by then, their words had lost weight. The community had seen too much, heard too much, to believe their polished lies. The tension reached its peak when I received a court summons for the demolition order reinstated under a different clause, slipped through while the chaos unfolded. It was the final blow they thought would end me. I stood in my yard that night, wind pushing through the crops, staring at the notice nailed to my gate. The moonlight caught the print, just enough for me to see the deadline: 10 days. 10 days before they tried to destroy everything again. But this time, they weren't the only ones with power. Under the pale glow of the barn's single bulb, I laid every piece of evidence on the workbench. The letters, the fines, the photographs, the timelines, the redacted reports. It looked less like paperwork and more like a battlefield mapped out on paper. Every document told a story of arrogance, deceit, and quiet cruelty. 10 days. That was all I had before their demolition order took effect. 10 days to prove what they were doing wasn't enforcement, it was vengeance. The air felt heavy with dust and anticipation. I didn't sleep much that week. Each night, I worked until the sun bled across the horizon, cross-referencing signatures, tracing connections between contractors, payments, and permits. What I found was more than I expected: falsified inspection records, approval forms signed by people who had left the board months before, invoices marked confidential, It was corruption wrapped in bureaucracy. The journalist helped me compile everything into a dossier clean, concise account of the abuse of power and procedural manipulation. We sent copies to local regulators, the county attorney, and the press. When the first report aired on the evening news, the response was immediate and volatile. Calls flooded the HOA's office. The once silent neighbors now demanded answers, asking where their money had gone, why certain projects were never completed, and why so much of the association's budget had been funneled through untraceable maintenance accounts. The board panicked. They tried to dismiss the report as misinterpretation, but with every word they spoke, they buried themselves deeper. The journalist uncovered emails showing that the demolition order wasn't about safety or compliance, it was retaliation for the media exposure. That revelation hit like a storm. The county placed an immediate hold on all HOA enforcement actions pending investigation. For the first time, I could breathe, but victory wasn't clean. The backlash from loyalists was fierce. Online threads filled with accusations, edited photos, rumors about my finances. They called me unstable, manipulative, a liar, seeking attention. It was strange, watching people I'd once waved to weaponize gossip as easily as the board had weaponized rules. Yet even their hate proved the truth. I'd shaken their illusion of control. The investigation grew larger. Auditors discovered that several board members had approved contracts benefiting relatives and friends. One had been billing the HOA for consulting services under a fake name. Another had used HOA funds to renovate his private property. It was greed, hiding behind a language of order. When the county attorney's office announced a formal inquiry, the tone of the neighborhood changed overnight. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still polished, but beneath the perfect surfaces ran a quiet current of fear. The once untouchable board now faced exposure, and the whispers that had once followed me now circled them instead. Still, they didn't stop trying. The HOA attempted to force a closed meeting, to vote on a measure that would temporarily restructure the board's authority and nullify pending investigations. It was an act of desperation disguised as procedure. But this time people showed up. The meeting hall overflowed with residents, people who had stayed silent for too long. The journalists attended too, camera rolling as voices rose, demanding accountability. I stood in the back, watching as the board that had terrorized me for months tried to maintain their composure. The chairperson read from prepared notes, but his voice trembled. When a resident asked about the missing funds, he faltered. When another demanded to see the demolition order's original signatures, he refused. The room erupted. It was no longer a meeting, it was an awakening. In the chaos, someone shouted that the board had violated their own bylaws. Another person waved a petition already filled with signatures, calling for immediate removal of every board member. The chair tried to adjourn, but the sound of collective outrage drowned him out. Cameras captured everything. The next day, the footage went viral. The HOA was finished. Within a week, the board resigned under pressure, citing personal reasons and community unrest. The county seized records, launched an audit, and suspended all enforcement powers until the investigation was complete. The demolition order was voided permanently. For the first time in months, I walked across my land without feeling watched. The wind felt lighter, the silence less heavy. The animals moved freely, no longer spooked by uninvited visitors. The barn, once a symbol of my defiance, now stood as proof that sometimes resistance isn't about shouting louder, it's about refusing to move when they expect you to fall. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal in small, halting steps. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months came by to apologize, some bringing small gifts or awkward words of support. Others still avoided eye contact, unable to face the reflection of their own silence. I didn't blame them. Fear makes good people small. But even in that quiet guilt, change had begun. A new interim committee formed, one focused on transparency and fairness. They reached out to me, asking for advice on how to prevent what happened from happening again. I agreed to help, not out of trust, but out of hope, because the truth was, I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted balance. On the final day of the investigation, the journalist visited my farm again. The sun was setting, painting everything gold, and for the first time in months, the air smelled like peace. She asked if I regretted anything, if it was worth it. I looked across the field at the fence line they once called a violation and thought about the cost. The sleepless nights, the fear, the constant fight just to exist freely on my own land. And then I realized something. The real battle was never about fences or bylaws, it was about the illusion of control, about how easily people surrender freedom for comfort, and how quickly comfort turns into compliance. I told her that sometimes the only way to expose corruption is to stand in its path and refuse to move. She smiled, wrote something down, and said it was a good ending. But I wasn't sure it was an ending at all, because power doesn't vanish. It hides, waits, rebuilds. And I knew somewhere, another HOA was already drafting another letter to someone who just wanted to live in peace. The difference now was that I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd learned what silence costs. Eddie learned what it means to fight for what is right when everyone tells you to stand down. The land was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels earned. As I locked the barn and watched the last light fade across the horizon, I realized the story wasn't about losing or winning. It was about holding your ground. So, if they came again with their papers and their rules and their hollow smiles, I'd be ready. Because some things peace, dignity, freedom aren't theirs to take. The morning of the court hearing began with silence so deep it felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself understood that this was the day everything would either collapse or finally stand tall. I had spent weeks preparing, every document catalogued, every photograph aligned in neat folders marked with trembling determination. The barn light had burned through the night while I rehearsed my statement over and over, each word carved from exhaustion and defiance. When I finally stepped outside, the frost clung to the edges of the fence, and the faint outline of my property stretched before me like a memory I might soon lose. The courthouse sat at the center of town, sterile and grey, its walls indifferent to the human cost of the battles waged inside. The HOA's legal team arrived first. Sharp suits and colder smiles, carrying binders thick enough to crush the truth beneath paperweight. Their confidence was a weapon, honed through years of intimidating anyone who dared to resist. I walked past them without a word, the echo of my boots on the tile floor the only sound that belonged to me. Inside the courtroom, faces blurred into a sea of murmurs, neighbors, reporters, even strangers drawn by the story that had grown larger than our small community. The judge entered, expression unreadable, and the proceedings began with the precision of machinery. The HOA's attorney spoke first, painting me as reckless, disruptive, a threat to the sanctity of their precious uniformity. Each sentence dripped with practiced civility, the kind that hides poison beneath polish. They displayed photos of my property taken out of context, framed to exaggerate flaws, and read selective excerpts from bylaws twisted to sound absolute. Their case was crafted not on truth, but on exhaustion, designed to make the listener weary enough to stop caring. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, every heartbeat pounding like a drum inside my chest. My hands trembled as I placed the evidence binder on the table, but my voice didn't. I spoke not like someone defending property, but like someone defending the right to exist without permission. I laid out the timeline, the harassment, the falsified reports, the intimidation, the vandalism, the photograph of my family left on my windshield. Gasps rippled through the room when I presented the security footage, grainy but undeniable, showing board members trespassing under the guise of inspection. Then came the invoices, the financial discrepancies, the contracts linking the board to their own shell companies. The journalists' reports flashed on the screen, corroborated by public records. Piece by piece, the story unfolded not as defiance, but as exposure. The HOA's counsel objected repeatedly, their calm veneer cracking with each new revelation. But the judge overruled them more often than not. By the time I finished, the silence that followed was heavy, tangible, like air before a storm breaks. The HOA chairperson, once so composed, now sat rigid, color drained from his face, his gaze darting toward the lawyers who suddenly looked far less certain. For a moment, no one spoke. The judge asked a single question that cut through the tension. Had the HOA knowingly used falsified documents to justify enforcement actions? Their lawyer hesitated, fumbling for language, but the pause was enough. The damage was done. The hearing extended into the afternoon, arguments circling like vultures over a carcass of excuses. Outside, the crowd had grown, whispers spreading faster than the official statements inside. News outlets filmed the courthouse steps, reporters narrating the unraveling of power in real time. By the time we adjourned, The board's facade had cracked wide open. They had built their authority on fear and paperwork. But under scrutiny, it collapsed like wet cardboard. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Power doesn't die quietly, it thrashes. As I left the courthouse, the air was thick with questions and flashing cameras. But in the distance, I saw something that made my heart lurch. Group of board loyalists gathered by the parking lot, their expressions cold, unreadable. They didn't shout or threaten, they just watched. Their stillness somehow more menacing than any words. I kept walking, but their eyes followed me like shadows that refused to fade. That night, the news broke everywhere. Local HOA under investigation for fraud and harassment. The story was picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Social media lit up with outrage. People across the country shared their own stories, their own scars, from petty tyrants hiding behind HOA titles. It was no longer just my feat, it had become a symbol. Yet even as the tide turned in my favor, the board wasn't finished. Power, when cornered, lashes out with desperation, and I knew the next strike would come soon. The following morning proved me right. A plain white envelope waited on my doorstep, no return address, no markings except for my name typed neatly across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing one sentence. You don't know who you're dealing with. My stomach turned cold. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. It was their last card, the threat behind the system, the reminder that exposure doesn't erase malice. I turned on every light in the house that night, pacing, replaying every possible next move in my mind. The investigation had stripped them of control, but it hadn't stripped them of reach. For days, tension gripped the community like a fever. Rumors flew about. Resignations, arrests, missing funds. The county confirmed ongoing inquiries, but the board's remaining members vanished from public view. The journalist called it the calm before the reckoning. She was right. The reckoning came faster than anyone expected. A week later, a subpoena surfaced on order demanding the HOA hand over all internal communications and financial records. Hidden within those records was the proof everyone had been waiting for. An email chain where the chairperson explicitly instructed others to neutralize non-compliant homeowners by all means necessary. The phrase all means necessary reverberated through the news cycle, its sinister tone undeniable. It was no longer a story of community management gone wrong. It was a scandal of organized abuse of power. The climax wasn't in the papers or the court filings. It was in the realization that people who had once been untouchable were now being forced to answer. Yet amid the chaos, the fear persisted. Anonymous calls, cars idling too long outside my gate, the sound of gravel shifting under unseen footsteps at night. The system was cracking, but its remnants were still dangerous. I stood by the fence one evening, staring at the boundary that had started this entire war, and felt the weight of both victory and vigilance. I knew the next court date would be the final battle, the day everything came to light in full view. The day they would no longer be able to hide behind their polished signatures and hollow rules. I didn't know then what the outcome would be, only that I had already crossed a line I could never retreat from. The truth was out there now, alive and irreversible, and the only thing left was to see how much of their empire would burn before the end. The final hearing arrived under a sky the color of steel, the kind that makes the air taste like rain and consequence. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras poised for a verdict that had already taken shape in the court of public opinion. Inside, the hallways hummed with restrained chaos, whispered questions, hurried footsteps, the rustle of paper and nerves. I walked through it all, feeling the strange calm that comes when fear finally burns itself out. The board members were already there, pale and rigid, their once perfect posture bending under the weight of exposure. The chairperson avoided my eyes, his hands trembling as he arranged his stack of documents, but the trembling betrayed what the suit tried to conceal: defeat. When the judge entered, the room settled into silence, so sharp it seemed to slice through the air itself. The proceedings began with the county investigator presenting the newly uncovered evidence: the emails, the altered reports, the financial discrepancies now confirmed by auditors. Each exhibit landed like a hammer blow. The words misuse of funds, forged authorization, abuse of power echoed through the chamber, erasing months of denials in a single cascade of proof. Faces that had once carried arrogance now held only the dull reflection of ruin. The chair tried to interject, to twist intent into misunderstanding, but his voice cracked, and the judge's gavel ended his sentence mid-breath. The moment felt endless. I watched years of intimidation unravel before me, strand by strand, until all that remained was the naked truth, ordinary greed and control, hiding behind polished language. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the story as it happened. The letters, the fines, the trespassing, the fear. I told them about the photograph left on my car, the vandalism, the quiet nights when headlights lingered too long outside my gate. I told them how rules meant to protect had been twisted into weapons meant to destroy. As I spoke, I felt the weight of every sleepless night shift from my shoulders to theirs. The courtroom, once heavy with hostility, now felt like an exhale years overdue. When I finished, the judge leaned back, expression unreadable, and said only that justice would speak through the record. The gavel struck once, a single sharp sound that felt like thunder inside my chest. Outside, the air broke open into rain. It fell hard and fast, drenching the reporters, the onlookers, the fading authority of the board members as they hurried through the storm. I stood on the courthouse steps and let it soak through me. The fight had been long, brutal, dehumanizing, but at that moment I understood what survival really meant. It wasn't about winning, it was about enduring long enough for the truth to breathe. Over the next days, the fallout spread quickly. The board members resigned or were suspended pending criminal review. Investigators confirmed misappropriation of funds, coercion of homeowners, and falsified documents. The county froze the HOA's assets and announced plans for dissolution. News segments replayed the story on endless loops. The farm that fought back, HOA scandal rocks suburban community. My name became shorthand for resistance, for standing your ground when the system insists you don't belong. Yet, victory felt complicated. The land was safe now, the demolition order void, the liens erased. But the scars remained in quiet ways. The reflexive glance at every car that slowed near the property, the tightening in my chest when mail arrived. Still, life began to return. The animals settled, neighbors started to wave again, and laughter from children echoed faintly through the streets that had once been silent with tension. Change moved slowly but undeniably. A state task force proposed reforms to HOA oversight, citing my case as catalyst. What began as a local dispute had become a spark that illuminated a nationwide problem. Letters arrived from strangers, farmers, retirees, families, people who'd faced their own small tyrannies and finally felt seen. I kept them all in a box by the porch, a reminder that defiance, when shared, becomes community. One afternoon, weeks after the verdict, I received a certified envelope from the county clerk. Inside was a single document bearing an official seal. Notice of property restorational rights reinstated. The paper was dry, impersonal, yet holding it felt like touching freedom itself. I walked the perimeter of my land, the same path I had taken the night. The first notice appeared months before. The fences stood, the crops swayed in the wind, and the barn, stubborn, proud, caught the afternoon light, just right. The silence no longer carried threat, it carried peace. But beneath the calm ran an awareness that would never fade. That power left unchecked grows like ivy, slow and strangling, and someone always has to cut it back. As the sun sank behind the trees, I looked across the property that had cost me so much and realized the true victory wasn't that I had kept the farm. It was that I had refused to surrender the person I was within it. The camera of the journalist caught me at that moment, standing alone in the fading light, and when the footage aired later, it became the image that closed the story, the farmer who stood against the system and didn't break. The narration ended with her voice, but the words might as well have been mine. That sometimes justice isn't loud, sometimes it's just the quiet after the storm, when everything cruel has finally run out of breath. I turned toward the gate where the first letter had once hung, the same gate now marked by a small sign carved by hand, private property protected by truth. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled, because the fight was over, but the story had only just begun. The weeks that followed the trial felt strange, like the world had shifted slightly off its axis and was slowly finding its balance again. After months of tension, fear, and noise, the quiet that settled over the neighborhood was almost unsettling. It wasn't the same kind of silence that once carried threat. This one was different, heavier, thoughtful. People walked slower now. They talked softer. Even the air seemed to carry an awareness of what had happened, as if the entire community had learned something about itself that it couldn't unlearn. For the first time in a long while, I could wake up without dread, clawing at the edges of morning. The light came through the window differently, warmer somehow, no longer filtered through the haze of anxiety. The farm was calm, the animals steady, the sound of the wind brushing through the crops like a whisper that things were finally returning to what they were meant to be. But peace, I discovered, isn't a return, it's a rebuilding. Every victory leaves behind debris, pieces of what was lost. And I spent those early weeks picking up the remnants of a life that had been paused too long. The mailbox that had once been a source of dread now carried letters of gratitude, not threats. Some were from neighbors who had once stayed silent, now apologizing in shaky handwriting. Others came from people far away, strangers who had seen the story online or on the news. They told me about their own battles with injustice, their own quiet wars against power that hid behind rules and paperwork. They thanked me for not giving up. Reading those letters made me realize something I hadn't seen before, that what had started as a personal fight had become something much larger. It had become proof that small resistance could ripple outward, that one person refusing to bend could inspire others to stand straighter, and that, more than any legal victory, was what made the struggle worth it. The HOA was gone now, officially dissolved. The county had assumed temporary oversight, and an independent committee was working to reorganize community management under fairer, transparent terms. The investigation had revealed years of mismanagement, hidden spending, and quiet coercion that reached beyond my case. Lawsuits followed, some civil, some criminal. A few board members vanished from town, their houses sold quietly, their names forgotten as quickly as their power. But the damage they'd done lingered in subtle ways. The mistrust between neighbors, the unease in casual conversations, the way people glanced around before speaking freely. Rebuilding trust, I realized, takes longer than rebuilding fences. Yet, slowly, it began to happen. One evening, as the sun set behind the fields, a small group of neighbors came by. People who had once looked away now stood in my yard, holding boxes of seedlings, tools, and fresh paint. They said they wanted to help restore the farm, to undo, in some small way, what had been broken. We spent the next few weekends working side by side, mending the barn door, repainting the fence, planting rows of flowers near the gate where the first notice had once been nailed. Every nail driven, every brushstroke, felt like a quiet apology from a community learning how to make amends. The journalist visited again, recording footage for a follow-up piece. She asked if life felt normal now, if I believed in the idea of community again. I remember pausing before answering, because normal felt too small a word for what had changed. I told her that maybe this was better than normal, that maybe the point wasn't to return to what was, but to become something stronger because of what happened. She smiled and said the story would end on that note, but I knew it didn't really end there. Stories like this never end. They evolve. The legal victories kept coming quietly in the background. The state legislature, under pressure from growing public outrage, began drafting new laws to regulate homeowners associations, requiring financial transparency, limits on enforcement powers, and independent audits. They called it the Homeowner Protection Reform Act, and when the bill passed months later, reporters reached out again, asking for comment. I didn't say much as that it was about time, but privately, the news hit deeper than I expected. The idea that my small fight, my little farm, had somehow helped push something that big into motion felt surreal. Change always seems impossible until you've already bled for it. Life on the farm settled into a rhythm again, simple but hard-earned. I spent mornings tending to the crops, afternoons repairing old structures that had weathered too much, evenings sitting on the porch watching the horizon fade into soft amber light. The land healed as I did. There were scars, yes, both visible and not. But scars are proof of survival. The barn still bore faint scratches from the night it had been broken into. But instead of erasing them, I left them their reminder of what it had cost to keep this place standing. People began visiting, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes to thank me in person. Some came from nearby towns, others from across the country, each bringing their own stories of resilience. One man, a former HOA president, who'd resigned after realizing how corrupt his own board had become, told me he wished he'd found the courage sooner. A young couple said they'd nearly lost their home over similar fines, but fought back after watching my story unfold online. Those moments made the exhaustion worth it. Each person who refused to be silent was proof that the chain of fear had started to break. And yet, even amid the gratitude and recognition, there were nights when the memories still pressed close, the late hours spent staring out the window, wondering if headlights would stop again, the faint anxiety that came every time I heard footsteps outside. Trauma doesn't vanish when the battle ends. It lingers like the echo of thunder after a storm has passed. But even that fear became smaller with time, shrinking in the shadow of everything I'd reclaimed. A new community council was eventually formed. One built not on control but collaboration. They asked me to serve as an advisor, and though I hesitated at first, I accepted, not because I wanted authority, but because I wanted to ensure no one else would ever face what I did. The first meeting was awkward, quiet, uncertain. But beneath the hesitation was something genuine, and eagerness to do better. The new bylaws was simple, transparent, and fair. Homeowners would have a say in every major decision. Financial records would be public, and enforcement actions required unanimous consent from an elected committee. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough. Months passed and the story faded from the headlines, as stories do. But its echo lived on in the conversations it sparked. Universities used the case in lectures about community governance. Legal experts cited it in debates about property rights. For me, though, it wasn't theory, it was life. I had learned that justice doesn't arrive like lightning. It moves like water, slow, steady, wearing down stone until it finally finds its way through. I found peace, not in victory, but in knowing I had faced something built to break me and was still standing. The day I paid off the last of my legal fees, I took that final receipt and nailed it to the inside of the barn door, right where the demolition notice had once hung. A small act of defiance turned full circle into closure. Sometimes I still catch myself looking out over the fields, remembering the nights when everything seemed lost. But instead of fear, there's gratitude, no gratitude, for the people who stood up when it mattered, for the resilience I didn't know I had, and for the land that never stopped holding me steady even when everything else fell apart. The journalist's documentary eventually aired, titled The Price of Silence. The final shot was of me walking down the dirt path at dusk, the camera pulling back as the wind moved through the crops. The voiceover said something about courage, about how the smallest voices can echo the loudest when they refuse to fade. Watching it later, alone in the farmhouse, I realized she was right. The story wasn't about winning against an HOA, it was about proving that integrity can survive even the ugliest battles of power and pride. As the screen faded to black, I thought about everyone still fighting their own versions of this story. And I hoped they knew one thing, that the moment you stop being afraid of them, they lose everything. The next morning, when I stepped outside and saw the sunlight catching the edge of the old fence, I felt it deep in my chest. Freedom doesn't come from permission. It comes from persistence. And sometimes, all it takes to change the world is one person deciding they've had enough. The seasons turned again, and with each cycle the land seemed to breathe deeper, as if exhaling years of tension. Spring arrived with soft rain that soaked the fields until they glimmered like mirrors, every drop carrying a quiet sense of renewal. The crops grew thicker, the animals calmer, and for the first time since the fight began, I noticed the sound of laughter drifting faintly from neighboring yards. Children rode bicycles down streets that had once felt hostile, and people began waving again, not out of obligation, but out of something real. Healing had taken root, not through rules or meetings, but through shared exhaustion with conflict. In the months that followed, a local college invited me to speak about what had happened. I hesitated at first. Standing before an audience felt foreign after so much isolation. But when I stepped onto the stage and saw the faces looking back, students, homeowners, lawyers, and ordinary people, I understood why they were there. They weren't listening for revenge or victory. They wanted to believe that standing up still mattered. I told them the truth, that courage isn't loud or glamorous, it's lonely and exhausting, but it's the only thing that keeps power from consuming everything quiet and decent. The applause that followed wasn't for me, it was for the idea that justice can come from persistence rather than privilege. After that, letters arrived again, this time from organizations asking for help shaping better community policies. I offered what I could: experience, advice, cautionary tales. The reforms spread slowly, one community at a time, each one learning to trade fear for fairness. In small towns and large suburbs alike, board meetings changed tone. Transparency became expectation, not charity. People began recording sessions, reading bylaws, asking questions. The machinery of quiet control started to rust. One evening, a year after the final verdict, I stood by the same fence where everything had begun. The wood was smoother now, repainted by volunteers from the neighborhood. Wildflowers grew along its edge, bright and unruly, spilling color onto the gravel path. I ran my hand along the boards and felt the rough places beneath the imperfections that told a story of what the surface tried to hide. It struck me then how similar that was to people. We polish our lives, our neighborhoods, our reputations, pretending they're seamless. But underneath there are always rough edges, reminding us of who we really are. The fight had stripped away every illusion I'd had about civility and authority. But it had also revealed something truer, that communities survive not through sameness, but through compassion. The HOA had wanted control. What it got instead was connection. Later that summer, the journalist returned one last time. She wanted an update for a follow-up piece about life after the storm. We sat on the porch as the sun sank low, the air thick with the scent of soil and evening dew. She asked if forgiveness had ever come. I forgave the people who had turned against me. I thought for a long time before answering. Forgiveness, I told her, isn't about pretending the hurt never happened. It's about deciding it won't define what happens next. I didn't forgive out of kindness but out of necessity, because holding on to anger meant staying chained to them forever. She nodded, writing quietly as crickets started their chorus beyond the field. That night, after she left, I stayed outside long after darkness had swallowed the sky. The stars looked different now, closer somehow. Or maybe I was just seeing them without fear for the first time in years. The silence was no longer empty. It was alive. I realized I wasn't waiting for another fight, another letter, another battle. The war was over, and in its place was something better than peace, understanding. In the following years, the story continued to ripple outward. Documentaries, op-eds, conferences, it all became bigger than I ever intended. Some people turned it into a symbol of rebellion, others into a lesson in governance. But to me it remained something simpler. Proof that truth, no matter how small, can outlast corruption when someone refuses to look away. The farm thrived again. Harvest festivals returned. Children visited to feed the goats, and laughter replaced the old whispers. The community council grew stronger, learning from every mistake. They introduced mentorship programs for new homeowners, created open forums, and even set aside funds for conflict mediation. Where there had once been intimidation, there was now accountability. Time softened everything that anger had hardened. I saw former board supporters at town events, eyes lowered but no longer hostile. Some offered quiet nods of respect, and that was enough. We didn't need apologies. We needed coexistence. The land itself seemed to mirror that sentiment, new growth sprouting through the cracks of old scars. One afternoon I found a faded piece of paper wedged behind the barn beams. One of the early violation letters that had somehow survived the cleanup. The ink had bled, the words nearly erased by time and weather. I held it for a moment before feeding it into the fire pit. Watching it burn didn't feel vengeful, it felt like closure. Ash drifted upward, disappearing into a sky too vast to hold grudges. As the flames dimmed, I realized that the true measure of victory isn't what you keep, it's what you can finally let go of. In the years that followed, I was asked many times what advice I would give to anyone facing their own version of my story. My answer never changed. Document everything, stand your ground, and never mistake silence for peace. Because power thrives in quiet corners, and justice begins the moment someone dares to turn on the light. Eventually, the media attention faded, as all stories do. Life returned to something close to ordinary, though ordinary now carried the weight of everything that had come before. And that was fine. Ordinary was enough. Every morning I still walked the fields, checked the fences, and listened to the wind move through the crops. The sound no longer reminded me of warnings, it reminded me of endurance. Sometimes standing there at dawn, I would think about the people who had then yet found their voice, the ones still afraid to fight back, and I hoped they could feel the echo of what had happened, here like a pulse beneath the surface reminding them they're not alone. On the anniversary of the trial, the new council organized a community gathering. No speeches, No cameras, just food, music, and laughter. As the evening settled and lights twinkled along the fences, someone handed me a small wooden plaque engraved with words that caught me off guard. For proving that one person can make a community honest again. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I just stood there, listening to the sound of people talking freely, children chasing each other through the grass, and realized that this simple, ordinary joy was the real resolution. The fight had started with destruction, but it ended with belonging. When the night grew quiet and the crowd drifted home, I stayed by the fire pit until the embers glowed faintly against the dark. The land stretched wide and endless around me, alive with possibility. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, and I smiled at the thought that life always finds a way to speak, even after being silenced. I took one last look at the fields, at the fence that had once divided me from them all, and whispered a truth that had taken years to learn, that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the courage to rebuild after the storm. And in that moment, as the wind carried the scent of earth and smoke across the open night, I knew the story was no longer mine. Alone, it belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet and finally decided not to.